So I would like to start with a comment about language and culture, because we have this topic of cultural diversity here in this particular IPC as a focal theme. So language is a topic that I would say to be understood from the context of cultural diversity, which philosophers have not done much. Philosophers have, of course, we have seen that Wittgenstein has talked about culture, philosophy. Different philosophers have, of course, talked about it, but particularly it's not the way people wanted to make a change in our society, especially from a feminist perspective. So I'm trying to talk about the feminist perspective on philosophy of language. So it's a little bit critique. You can imagine, of course. So especially if we connect language and culture, our metaphysical discussions and debates over philosophy of language would open a different mode of contemplation. And if we discuss it's from the perspective of gender, it again will open another kind of contemplations, of course, doors for contemplations. Of course, it's a recent phenomena. In the postmodern era, we could say that people started talking more about language, the issue with language, the way we look at language, the way we philosophize language also. The traditional philosophy of language papers we would always talk about from the start of 19th century, 20th century actually, with thinkers like Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein, etc. But is that what we have to do? Should we close our minds within the this particular traditional structure that we have gotten from the Western tradition as philosophy of language, to talk about philosophy of language only like that? So this is a critique on that. Of course, we can see from the time of Aristotle, ancient philosophy and Indian philosophy also, we are doing philosophy of language in very many ways, I would say. But my problem here in this particular paper, my point is about the initiation of a feminist philosophy of language. So if we look at the history of Western philosophy, for Aristotle, the human is the being that has the logos. Even in the beginnings of metaphysics, we can see a kind of intimate interrelationship that was thought about between social being and language. So Aristotle would say human is the being that has the logos, who can speak and is thus therefore associated. But that human was only those beings who are categorized as man, that means male human beings. Women were not included at all in that. If you look at the history of philosophy, it's quite visible that we don't have any thinkers as such in the history of philosophy. So in terms of the use of language, in terms of the capacity to use, or the power, authority, or the right to use language, etc., it's all about very patriarchal, that we can say. So this inherited unquestionable about the non-associated female beings started lingering in the history only recently, the questioning of this issue. Women didn't have any role in gaining mastery over language and in its use. Feminist philosophy of language put forward an entirely distinctive way of seeing things in terms of the mastery over the concepts of language. This includes the call for understanding language in its culturally embedded metaphysical and social constructionist aspects. This is also authorizing us to appraise the gender questions in language. So feminist philosophers of language, critically, if you Google, you can see a lot of works nowadays, plenty of articles coming up regarding this, but it's not within the structures, historic documented structures of philosophy. The feminist philosophers of language critically engaged with Derrida. They have engaged with Derrida, Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault very intensely in the postmodern era to discuss, because they had been discussing language very much. And they were the prominent figures in the field of philosophy. So they had been, the women thinkers like Julia Kristeva, was a contemporary to Derrida, and they had been like discussing around deconstruction, discourse analysis, and so on and so forth. Though they had done their own work, they had to engage with them also, which came into light a little bit. So in this paper, I was mainly trying to discuss Lucy Irigaray and Julia Kristeva. I may not go into those details that much because it's only a short presentation which is possible here. So I will just throw some points, whatever I wanted to make it with this paper. So the assumption that metaphysical statements are meaningful was questioned by the philosophers of language, of course, who posed questions about the whole metaphysical enterprise as well. If we look at the history of philosophy, it has been always a metaphysical enterprise. Even now, it's even within the point is that criticism here would be even within the traditional structures and philosophy of language, it also had become another kind of metaphysical thinking, because they found they are discussing these all things with a basis that with a presumption, to say so, that there is something called language out there, very solid, absolute, or whatever, like a metaphysical entity. So the debate on metaphysics of gender contributed by feminist philosophers such as Simone de Beauvoir initially. Many different thinkers are there, of course, some of them are familiar now. Julia Kristeva, Judith Butler, Lucy Irigaray, all have done some discussion regarding this issue of metaphysics within the structures of social construction, postmodern social constructionist realm. So I would come to this discussion a little bit by saying that the theme of negation of metaphysics drastically flourished after the era of traditional historical period of analytical philosophy. In a way, what we are discussing about philosophy of language as a particular set of people or a set of discussion. This is actually this 20th century development in Western philosophy. This has actually questioned this issue of metaphysics. But at the same time, also we claim that the so-called linguistic turn of analytical philosophy. So this analytical philosophy, which was coming up during that time, and the particular linguistic turn that we are talking about in this particular so-called written history of Western philosophy, that has to be that is very crucial, of course. But at the same time, language has been taken as a central concern in the analytic tradition of philosophizing, and the linguistic turn of analytic philosophy is well known for all the enterprises of making knowledge of reality and truth based on the idea that only language exists. So, which means this is becoming a kind of another metaphysical conception of an absolute language, something absolute language with absolute meaning, or what it is. So, afterwards, in the continental philosophy, though this is also under debate, of course, the phase where people turned to an continental philosophy from language philosophy. So this analytic philosophy and its linguistic turn, and from there to the continental philosophical discussion. So this is the phase where feminist philosophers are developing their own philosophy of language. But this is the only gap they could take up to make a point of this issue of gender insensitivity in philosophizing, also in philosophizing language. So this line of thought again falls into this absolutism and so on and so forth issues of metaphysical thinking. So this issue had been addressed in a critical way by the postmodern and post-structuralist philosophers of language, including philosophers of gender. So that's why philosophers of gender were very much influenced by these thinkers as Derrida and Foucault. So in this paper I am trying to put that also in a detailed manner. The metaphysics of language itself has its sources, but I am trying to also connect with the discussion which philosophers of gender were so crucial, so particular about, to connect with the socio-cultural political aspects to discuss philosophy of language. Philosophy of language is not at all just this, particularly in the discussion with other thinkers, we can see that about the issue of symbolic and aspects, symbolic, syntactic, semiotics aspects, etc. The metaphysics of language itself has its source in cultural context, and it has, according to philosophers of feminist philosophers of language, and it has its effect too on the cultures or societies through repeated use, through the laying down of a history of use. So this has all been patriarchal, of course, and embedded in the history and cultures are not simply the things that have been said and done, but the identities and status of the people who have said and done them. The identity and status of the people, which is all, which are also really connected with their backgrounds. An individual act, therefore, enters into a broader discourse, and its ultimate effect will be the result of its life in the discourse. In the dominant discourse, to say so, how it gets picked up and by whom, and how it mixes with what other people are doing and thinking. So these all are issues that has to be taken up. We can find the reason why the analysis of language, which is a form of an individual or group act of speech or writing, should address the fact that it affects the broader discourse and thus the lives of the people. So it's quite contradictory to what Wittgenstein said about private language, and there's no private language, etc. It would come like that. So the purpose, so this kind of, for these wonderful examples have been put forward by feminists, that the women used to, it is a stunning example of course, the introduction of the social title MS, Miss, instead of MISS or MRS. Mrs., Miss, and for men it's only Mr. So why women are having this kind of title? So it was the US feminists did in late 60s. The purpose was to provide an equivalent to Mr., a term that designates gender but not marital status. This was left to be particularly this was felt very much for them to be done, because particularly it's an important issue, because unlike men, women were judged, qualified and disqualified, included, excluded, etc. on the basis of their marital status. In India also, feminists have tried to cut their second name to not to express their marital status or their caste or their whatever, clan or whatever. So this has been a political move as well. Western feminist theorists have tried to propagate the importance of language in the modern time with such claims of independent identities. They have envisaged the male-centeredness of the language and how it causes the women's secondary status in the societies. The idea that language exists independently of social and cultural embeddedness was questioned by feminist philosophers of language to elaborate upon how language constructs meanings of gender in different cultural contexts. This was extended in the postmodern and feminist thought to the discussion on social construction of gender. language is a social institution that affects the individual's behavior, internalization of conceptions about the world. The role of language is the gendering of people. The role of language in the gendering of people is undoubtedly established as part of the feministization of language. In the stream of patriarchal knowledge, feminists intervened strongly with the critique against the androcentric nature of function and language that formulated the identities and subjectivities. With the post-structuralist perspective, feminist criticism maintains that language is the site of cultural production of gender identity. This stream of theorization has apparently unearthed a wider and deeper insight into the inquiry on the problem as to how people get gendered. In view of that, the language is the main gendering tool. Only by the breaking of the use of male-centered language, one can overcome the gendering process. Starting from the everyday colloquial language unto the progressive and academic language, the anti-woman sexist language elements are still followed consciously, unconsciously, or consciously too, of course. So a conscious deconstruction of language and its usage is an indispensable way to act against the gendered concepts and practices in our cultures. Lucy Irigaray, just a little bit about Lucy Irigaray and Julia Kristeva. I will mention a little bit about their theorization on language. They are still alive. They are 90 plus, 80 plus years old women now in the European French thinkers. Lucy Irigaray follows the thinking of post-structuralist theorists in asking questions about the liaison between language and bodies. Specifically male and female bodies and masculine and feminine language also. She focuses on the female body. Okay, it will be finished by then. Only I am mentioning these two thinkers a little bit, that's all. She focuses on the female body and how it has been constructed in phagocentric system like Freudian and Lacanian stuff. I am not going into this psychological analysis that they have done abundantly. But I will come into these other points around language specifically. So Irigaray asserts that the female sexuality has always been conceptualized and on the basis of masculine parameters and masculine languages. It was constructed by the masculine languages, language use, constructed by the language use of masculinity, to say so. She crosses. Irigaray's theory of sexual difference suggests that women could never be a subject in the ontology of substances in the Western culture, precisely because they are the relation of difference, the excluded. Women are also difference that cannot be understood as the simple negation of or the other of the always already masculine subject. Subject is always masculine, and women had been object or the other of the subject. Thus, they are neither subject nor its other in some level, but at just a difference. Even in the postmodern discussion, sometimes we could trace that kind of a tendency from the economy of binary opposition. Though we shift from the modern binary thought, still it comes into that kind of discussion in a way itself. Then metaphysically, the appearance of sex within hegemonic language as a substance is achieved through a performative twist of language and discourse that conceals the fact that being a sex or gender is fundamentally impossible. So this has been taken up by Judith Butler also very much to develop her theory of performativity. Now, coming to Julia Kristeva, another French thinker, linguistic philosopher and feminist too, followed the ideas of ideas of Lucy Irigaray as well to pursue a language different from the traditional one. She discussed the one term called abjection in her feministization, and she created that kind of words to discuss the issues with philosophy of language as well, and put forward the ideas of semiotic and symbolic in the debate around gender. Julia Kristeva is concerned with the subject's identity. She believes that the subject can gain her or his identity through language. When he or she expresses her or his intentions either directly or indirectly, she or he can claim her or his subjectivity. This is the process that we could understand from the analysis. In Kristeva's terms, the semiotic and the symbolic refer to two interdependent aspects of language. This is where she develops her philosophy of language. She is trying to elaborate upon that. I'm not going into that, but the crux of her arguments are like this. The semiotic is defined as the matriarchal aspect of language that shows the speaker's inner drives and impulses. The symbolic is the rule-governed aspect of language, which shows itself in the grammatical structures and figures and the pictures or whatever. And syntactic structures. We have seen it in from Frege or Wittgenstein and every other kinds of Russell, of course. Although the semiotic and the symbolic aspects of language oppose one another in either its nature, they complete each other in language. The speaker's speech is meaningful when both semiotic and the symbolic are together. And she's not trying to reject the symbolic, of course. She's trying to talk about it that only if it goes together, it makes sense. Otherwise, it's just masculine or that kind of philosophizing of language. So I will just conclude also talking about this. It all comes under a kind of also analysis on metaphysical discussion, but it turns into in Kristeva also we can see it's a turning towards postmodern post-structural discussion, social construction of language and social construction of gender. So language itself is socially constructed, and gender, of course, through language and various different factors. From the social constructionist viewpoint, it is not the cognitive processing of single observer that observes the object into itself, but it is language that does so. So the constructionist position holds that the concepts prevailing in the society are constructed and propagated by the language in use and exists and text in use and the text existing, use in vocabulary as well as in the text existing. Dominant texts, of course, construct conceptions of human beings. At the same time, it is yes. At the same time, it is also argued in social constructionist viewpoint that it is within social interaction that language is generated and sustained and even abandoned. Accordingly, the accounts of the world take place within the shared systems of intelligibility, which is usually spoken or written language, and also very patriarchal in general. So that we have to deconstruct it according to the social constructionist way, and also a discourse analysis method is also suggested by feminist thinkers. So by social constructionist method, a social constructionist view invites the investigator outward into the fuller realm of shared languages. The reflexive attempt is thus relational, emphasizing and the expansion of languages and of understanding. This reflexivity on subjectivity would also activate the latent language potentials in a researcher's linguistic community of understanding. Social constructionist standpoint would emphasize the functional basis of language within ongoing relationships. According to feminist philosophers of language, this is very important. According to social constructionist framework that they suggest, to generate understanding is to apply the existing language to the problem at hand. We have to abandon the problem of the origin of ideas, as such in general postmodern thinking, and shift the concern to the emergence of language within communities and cultures. The linguistic capacities emerge primarily as we acquire language of cultures. So the people approach their problems with a range of linguistic predispositions already at hand. For example, if we want to understand femininity, woman, etc., 2-3 sentences I am concluding. As per the social constructionist point of view, to understand femininity, masculinity, woman, man, etc., kind of the gender issues, that constructionist point of view, we would see them dependent on a language system within the cultural and social codes of communication. The traditional empiricist may find it as a problematic, but the emergence of theoretical ideas and new perspectives of addressing topics would encourage new vistas of conceptual studies. In a general analysis of addressing topics would encourage new vistas. In a generalized language, the entire formulation is based on an elaboration of definitions already embedded within the cultural code, the confirmations of disconfirmations of hypotheses through research findings are achieved through social consensus, not through observation of the facts, like in the dominant philosophers of language said. The empirical test is possible because the conventions of linguistic indexing are fully shared, that they appear to reflect reality. As Feyerabend said, I'll conclude with this, held the reflexive concern of various culture forms of discourse should be a continuous undertaking in which all subcultural enclaves should be invested, and this may open a space for research endeavors which are specifically cognizant of the researchers and enmeshment within a culture of multiple languages. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Maya. She tried to establish